We now transition from looking at the skeptics who argued for the sake of skepticism to look at René Descartes, a philosopher who took on skepticism to use as a method to refute skepticism. Little background for Descartes. Descartes was born March 31st, 1596, in what was then La Haye, France, now named Descartes, France. He received his education at a Jesuit college of La Flèche, which I'm probably mispronouncing horribly. He earned a degree in law, and he joined armies to see the world, meet interesting people, and presumably shoot at them. On November 10th, 1619, he was shut in for the winter, because during those days armies sensibly did not fight during the winters because it was pretty cold. And he had 3 very vivid dreams. These dreams gave him a mission, presumably a mission from God, to solve the mysteries of nature through philosophy, based on mathematical reasoning. And out of gratitude for these dreams, he vowed to make a pilgrimage to the Italian shrine of Our Lady of Loreto. Now in 1649, he got what seemed to be a dream job, because back during this time period, philosophers often endeavored to become the philosophers of royalty, because they had lots of money and paid pretty well. And so in 1649, he became tutor of Queen Christina of Sweden. Now unfortunately this worked out rather badly for Descartes. She was one of those people who liked to be up very early, and so apparently her classes with Descartes were at 5 a.m. Also, Sweden is rather cold, and apparently Descartes died of pneumonia on February 11th, 1650, thanks to getting up very early and thanks to the cold, which teaches 2 very important lessons, which is, first, do not get up too early, and second, do not live any place very cold. And the reason why is, of course, you'll die. He wrote a lot of stuff. His works include the 1620 Rules for the Direction of the Mind. In 1633, he wrote Le Monde, and of course, the world translated into English. In 1637, he wrote the very long titled book Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and Seeking the Truth in Sciences, which most people shorten down to Discourse on the Method, or even shorter down to simply the Discourse. In 1641, he wrote the work that he's most well known for, the Meditations on First Philosophy. In 1644, he wrote Principles of Philosophy, and in 1649, he wrote his final work, The Passions of the Soul. Now Descartes, like many philosophers during the time period he was doing his Descartesian stuff, had a very particular agenda. Now first we'll look at his motivation. He was rather dissatisfied with the philosophy and science of his time. And this is kind of a hallmark of the modern era of philosophy. Again, Renaissance to about the end of the beginning of the 19th century. He says that philosophy has been cultivated for many centuries by the most excellent minds, yet there is still no point in which it is not disputed and hence doubtful. Now, the foundation, which were rather shaky, were based on, he saw it, on philosophical assumptions. So basically his view was that the sciences are very shaky because they rest on philosophical assumptions, which in turn were very shaky. And so his motivation was basically this dissatisfaction, the idea that all is disputable and doubtful. Now, one thing that enabled him to sort of switch from the old ideas was that he grew tired of these, the fact that the teachers repeated the old ideas of Aristotle and the scholastics, and so what he did was set out on his famous intellectual journey. And also, his exposure to this vast diversity of opinion led him to more confusion and more doubt. So, as a solution to this, he endeavored to go on an inward journey, so he switched to an inward focus. He decided to quote him, undertake studies within myself, in one day to undertake studies within myself, and to use all the powers of my mind in choosing the paths I should follow. So his goal was to locate a solid foundation for the sciences. He's considered by some to be the father of modern philosophy, because of his autobiographical and individualistic approach to philosophy. One thing in philosophy is that when students write papers, or anyone writes papers, they can use the I reference to I. So you can say I think, I believe, and this is in part thanks to our good dead friend René Descartes. Now, unlike the medieval philosophers, he rarely uses quotes, and generally did not rely on arguments from authority. As you might recall from the ancient days of part 1 of the class, the argument from authority is when it is claimed that something is true based on the evidence, the premise that the person making the claim is an authority. In contrast, rather than relying on the authority of others, he operated primarily as a solitary thinker, working his way towards truth. And as I mentioned before, he was one of the first philosophers to make extensive use of personal pronouns. And to this day in philosophy, people typically write the same way, talking about, I think, I believe, I hold that, etc. Now, he also believed that individuals had the intellectual capabilities to discover truth on their own. Now, he didn't fall into subjectivism, because his belief wasn't that people would go off on their own and find all these other, separate subjective truths. His view was that these individual journeys would all lead to the same truths. So, what were his goals? Well, goal number 1 was to find certainty. The reason why, as we saw previously, is that doubts and conflicting opinions were weakening, undermining, shaking the foundations of science. Goal number 2, to create a universal science. This involved finding a unified set of principles from which he could deduce all answers to scientific questions. And objective 3 was to reconcile the scientific, mechanistic conception of the universe with human freedom and religion. So those were his 3 modest goals. So that brings us to the end of the introduction to René Descartes, and next we'll turn to his method.